Good morning. Welcome to my talk called The Diamond Heart, Interiority, Symbols, Soul and Presence. So I have a little synopsis here, which you can see on the slide as well. In this paper, I'm introducing the notion of interiority from the 5th century writings of the Christian theologian and philosopher St Augustine of Hippo. This has been the foundation of the Western Christian understanding of the nature and theology of the gradual spiritual ascent of the human soul in God for more than 1,000 years up to our modern times. Jung's analytical psychology and map of the soul can be understood as a modern path of interiority towards self or soul knowledge. I'm going to discuss two key psychological ideas and processes essential in our path of self-knowledge: the transformation of our shadow and the structure and function of symbols of transformation. I'm then going to amplify on two ways of knowing and explore several key symbols of the soul: castle, water, fountains, and butterfly, from a key Christian mystical text, St Teresa's 16th-century text, The Interior Castle. In her language of the soul, St Teresa's call to enter the castle of our soul, to attend to the garden of our soul, combines essential symbols of the soul's being in God and God's indwelling in the soul in transforming union. So the first section is St Augustine and Interiority, and there's a lovely picture of Augustine here. The notion of interiority and the relevance of introspection was very well recognized in antiquity. However, it was the 5th century that St Augustine of Hippo, the great Christian theologian, philosopher, church father and writer, understood and explored new understandings, theology and perception of our human soul, based on the Greek and Hebrew scriptures, which proved hugely important in defining Christian Western notions of selfhood for at least 1,000 years, well into our modern times. The great novelty that St Augustine brought was the idea of the inner person, homo interior, as an image of the triune God, and to the extent that in the essential triad of being, knowing, and loving, our soul mirrors the three divine persons, Father, Son, and Holy Spirit, and their substantial unity, and we can become a whole person in God. So St Augustine in the 4th century was the first in the history of Christian spirituality who expressed a key tendency of Christian mysticism, which implies a gradual, interior ascent of the human soul to God, which consists of three main stages: external, internal, and supernal, which corresponds to the spiritual journey of the soul to God from outward to inward and from lower to higher. In the ascent or descent to the core of our being, there is a journey from the knowledge of external beings to self-knowledge, and from our inner self or soul to direct mystical contemplation of God. So in Augustine's mystical paradigm, there are three successive stages. Extra nos, which is outside of us. from knowledge of the traces or signs of God's operations or energies as manifest in the external material world, to the second stage, intranos, which is within us, to the knowledge of God's image imprinted in the inner structure of our human soul, and the third stage, supranos, which is above us. Finally, to the transcendence of the very nature of our human soul in ecstasy and union with God. In the following centuries, and for 1,000 years into the modern era, this was the basic theological and psychological paradigm in the Western Christian mystical tradition, and it became known over the centuries as the triple way or threefold path, and is the traditional ancient Christian way of referring to the stages of psychological and spiritual growth, development, and transformation. Although not as widely used today, this threefold concept had considerable influence on the development of the Christian spiritual tradition over the centuries. The term most used to refer to these stages are the first stage as awakening, purification, and purgation, the second as the way of illumination, and the third as the way of union. So over the centuries, for 1,500 years, there are many variations and subdivisions which multiplied, but the core of this mystical doctrine has remained the same for more than 1,000 years into our modern era. The Christian mystical tradition reached a height of refinement with the Spanish Carmelite saints and mystics, St Ignatius of Loyola, St Teresa of Ávila, and St John of the Cross. They all make extensive use of this threefold path in their writings. St Ignatius, the founder of the Jesuits, relates the first week of his spiritual exercises to the way of purification, whilst weeks 2 and 3 correspond to that of illumination. Likewise, in St Teresa's mystical text, the Interior Castle, which I have focused on for half of my life, written many books and taught and studied and communicated this text to the wider community. The first mansions refer to the way of awakening and purification, those in the middle to the way of illumination, and the final interior mansions to the way of union. St John of the Cross's masterful exposition of the purgative way is in his famous treatise, The Dark Night of the Soul, and his Ascent of Mount Carmel, which are justly celebrated as very famous mystical treatises, whilst his spiritual canticle and living flame of love relate more to the 2 stages of illumination and union. So even in these early centuries, 4th and 5th century, in St Augustine's writing and understanding, our path initially requires us going into ourselves with a pure heart, so that we have uninterrupted desire to arrive at God. Even in St Augustine's Confessions, his famous autobiography, he writes, "Lord, let me know myself, and let me know you." Other very famous expressions from St Augustine, quote, "But you were more inward than my inward part, and higher than the highest element within me." So even in these early centuries, in his great writings. This conveys this movement of transcendence, of detachment from the external world, a return to our interiority, a return to ourselves, not in order to dwell in oneself alone, but to move beyond oneself towards the divine. The soul's inner ascesis, her transcending herself by entering the interior, leads to contemplation of God. Again, from Augustine, do not go outside, come back to yourself. It is in the inner self that truth dwells. And if you find your own nature to be subject to change, transcend even yourself. So thanks to this interior movement and perception, the soul is able to enter a realm of superior light, an extraordinary inner region where she is able to contemplate spiritual and eternal realities. In his Confessions, chapter 7, I entered, and with my soul's eye, such as it was, I saw above the same eye of my soul the immutable light which is higher than my mind. So interiority is understood as a privileged category through which it's possible to encounter the most intimate dimensions of our soul, by which we're led by Christ to travel to the mysterious reality of God. So even in these early centuries, for Augustine, this was not a privileged category for a few, but it became a Christian way, common and possible to all. According to the saying of Paul in Corinthians, we have the mind of Christ. And this journey can be realized through the grace of Christ and his teaching of the truth within our own interior soul, as the Word who speaks within. He is the truth, for all truth is but a participation in divine knowledge, the truth that is reached by interior light. So moving on to another area, which is Jung's map of the soul and the Christian mystical tradition. And here's a slide now of my book, which is The Diamond Heart. And a lot of this material is discussed and written about in this book. It's clearly evident that Jung's modern depth psychology and map of the soul can be seen and understood as a modern map and paradigm of the path of interiority towards divine knowledge, following the first and second stage of the soul's journey towards the divine, as I've outlined in Augustine's mystical paradigm, and the ancient understanding of the threefold way of the Christian mystical tradition. From Jung's understanding of the interior life, this telos of the psyche, according to depth psychology, is to move towards achieving individuation, which can be summarized as a process of integration of the psychological opposites within us, by which our unconscious material can be raised to consciousness and incorporated by it. Individuation is the name for the ongoing maturation process by which a person becomes a psychological individual, which is to say, a separate, undivided, conscious unity, a distinct whole by first the process of unifying ego consciousness and then the whole psychic system of conscious and unconscious in order to approach psychological wholeness, which is the basis, can only be the basis for authentic self-knowledge. In his writings, Jung emphasized repeatedly that the process of individuation is mainly a psychological journey towards self-knowledge and not necessarily a spiritual one. Even the great Christian writer and mystic Thomas Merton, of the 19th century American, also succinctly described the purpose of the individuation journey in a different way, which I think is helpful. Thomas Merton says, the first thing you have to do before you even start thinking about contemplation is to try to recover your basic natural unity, to reintegrate your compartmentalized being into a coordinated and simple whole and learn to live as a unified human person. This means that you have to bring back together the fragments of your distracted existence so that when you say I, there is really someone present to support the pronoun you've uttered. The worst thing that can happen to a person who is already divided up into a dozen different compartments is to seal off yet another compartment and tell them that this is more important than all the others, and that he must henceforth exercise a special care in keeping it separate from them. This is what tends to happen when contemplation is unwisely thrust without warning upon the bewilderment and distraction of Western people. End of Thomas Merton. Basically, what he's also trying to articulate is our inner life begins when I am. We have to have a sense of I amness, a real sense of I amness. There's really someone present when you can say, I am. So one of the really valuable achievements of Jungian psychology is the emphasis and importance of symbolic thinking, which helps us to understand our own religious and psychological perspectives in deeper and more vital ways. As transforming symbols come from the depths of our unconscious, from our creative psyche. We can become enriched by an inner creative life, which is full of meaning and connects us to ourselves, our I amness, and humanity in deeper and more loving, unitive ways. It's a way of growth and development as a kind of necessary surrender or sacrifice of our personal ego perspective alone, which eventually leads to symbols of transformation towards a larger personality or sense of self or soul, which unites both conscious and unconscious psyche towards the emergence of a transcendent function, which I'm going to explore soon. So here in this talk, I'm speaking to you now, but there's also a marvelous rose window that you can see behind me. We could understand this as a transforming symbol, an archetypal symbol of a mandala. There are rose windows throughout the Gothic cathedrals throughout the world. So this is an example of a transforming symbol, which we can experience within as a symbol of our deeper self or soul. The next area is transformation of our shadow. In our journey towards individuation and beyond, the interior path deepens and darkens as it progresses, as we become more conscious of our pre-verbal, instinctive drives, bodily passions and impulses, as well as, of course, touching transcendent realms. So as soon as we turn towards our interior world of self-reflection, self-knowledge and prayer, we always encounter whole dimensions of ourselves that have previously been hidden, unknown, or unconscious. Jung was very clear in his writings that our shadow encompasses all the psychic contents that have been driven back into our unconscious. So, all the neglected, undeveloped, unacknowledged parts of our personality, which we need to constantly recognize and accept, so that our shadow can be dissolved and transformed, made new in God's love and presence throughout our psychological and deeper spiritual journey. As our psychological journey grows and deepens, we always need to struggle to face, accept, and allow the transformation of the neglected unconscious dimensions of our psyche. And as St Teresa and the Christian writers always speak about, it takes a tremendous amount of humility, integrity, and self-honesty, together with charity and virtue, to really acknowledge our shadow and allow the long, arduous work of transformation to begin. The important psychological truth is that our shadow not only contains negative and destructive elements, but there's gold in our shadow, tremendous potential for deeper spiritual growth and development. Our shadow consists of 90% gold. Why? Because it contains the seed of our transformation, the very new potential which has not yet come to consciousness, which I'll talk about in a moment. So the confrontation with our shadow and its integration is completely essential in preparation for the crucial encounter with our deeper self or soul. So that's why the shadow qualities must first be made conscious, even at the risk of neglecting other aspects and figures presented by the psyche. We find the same knowledge, the same truth, the same path as expressed in all the myths and fairy tales, religious stories, and Jungian psychology specializes in amplifying and showing this, where the hero always needs a friend, his own shadow side, as a companion to overcome the dangers of the interior quest. So I'm moving on to symbols of transformation now. Jung's great volume 5, Symbols of Transformation, contains his theory and understanding about the structure and function of symbols of transformation. Very important volume, and this volume was the break essentially with Freud's perspective and psychology. Symbols and myths are psychologically expressions of interior psychic forces and libidinal dynamism as self-portraits of the movement of libido or energy within ourselves, and mirror dynamic processes both in our personal and collective unconscious. Jung essentially conceived our life energy or libido to be suspended between two opposing poles, our unconscious on one hand and consciousness on the other, and that it is the oppositions and interaction between these two poles that cause progressions and regressions of libido. He viewed human libido as pure, formless, undifferentiated, unspecified life energy, and compared the realm of the psychic opposites to the opposites of the light spectrum, and so developed his hypothesis about the polar nature of the collective unconscious. He viewed human libido as capable of infinite transformations. At the infrared end of the spectrum, our psychic functions change into instinctual and physiological processes, which can take the character of addictions, compulsions, obsessions, and the like, to the ultraviolet end of the scale as archetypes. That is, psychic structures that precondition human fantasies and ideas by producing symbolic images. And basically, this is a lot of the theoretical structure of Jungian psychology. So from this depth psychological perspective, the possibility of real interior transformation resides in moving towards and being in a three-dimensional symbolic mind. This means struggling with the opposites within us, or very different states of mind, to a third position, a new attitude to the creation of symbolic thinking that can unite and transcend opposites, leading to new synthesis and integration. And as we all know, often this passage from a one to two-dimensional to a three-dimensional state of mind is possible only under grueling conditions of sacrifice, surrender, and pain and suffering. Jung brilliantly called this the transcendent function, which is a natural developmental process where our opposite attitudes, goals, affects, and impulses conflict, collide, and coincide, which is our constant interior struggle. Self-reflection, deepening understanding, going back and forth, being washed back and forth, as the alchemists say, constantly washing our interior conflicts, pain and opposites, which is slowly circumambulating around a deeper sense of self. So the transcendent function is slowly moving our ego consciousness out of our assumption that we're in charge and in control of our life, through becoming aware of our conscious life and processes, to a bigger center, our deeper self or soul, which is growing. These three dimensions constitute an interactive interior space created by our readiness and openness to relate with one another, which increasingly allows for mutuality, change, and exchange. So symbols of transformation are an important part of all of our psychological and spiritual growth, development, and maturation, particularly in times of profound transition, breakdown, threshold, crises, and change. Symbols, images, and metaphors speak to our whole person, not just to the mind, but our heart, our senses, our memories, our body, our imagination, and the whole of the experiences that we have, and of course have the capacity to engage us much more fully than mental concepts alone. Jung, in his writings, gave just very famous, extraordinary amplification of the meaning of symbols. And what he was trying to psychologically explain, that symbols have a specific connotation in addition to their conventional and obvious meaning, but it also has a mystery, something vague, unknown, or hidden. So a symbol whispers to us of mystery, unknown. So when our mind encounters a great symbol, such as the rose window behind me, it's you can see the symbol, but it's also got a great mystery behind the symbol. So this is called the symbolic mode of perception. And I'm just going to very briefly walk around why this is so important. The transcendent function, the symbolic function, the third. So symbols provide an integrative healing function, which have the capacity to unite and connect and heal all the disparate, dissociated, unconscious parts of ourselves. And as I've already said a little bit, living dynamic symbols have the power to unite and transcend psychological opposites, our two-dimensional states of mind and thinking, the polarization, leading to a new synthesis in a third, in a transcendent perspective, and an integration at deeper levels of our being. Secondly, and Jung explained this very deeply in his Symbols of Transformation, Volume 5, they provide a transformative and transcending function, which I've tried to share with you this afternoon. So symbols are figurative constellations which point beyond themselves to more objective spiritual reality. So this is the transcendent function of symbols. Very important. It's not just what we're seeing in the visible, it's pointing to the invisible realm, what's beyond the symbol. Beautiful quote from volume 6 from Jung, quote, "The role of symbols express, quote, an as yet unknown and incomprehensible fact of a mystical or transcendent nature. So long as a symbol is a living thing, it is an expression for something that cannot be characterized in any other or better way. A symbol really lives only when it is the best and highest expression for something divined, but not yet known to the observer. It compels our unconscious participation and has life-giving and life-enhancing effect." And I'm not going to say much more about dreams at this moment, but of course our dream life is full of symbols of transformation. Very, very important part of our interior journey of self-knowledge and waking up to the transcendent elements within us. So I'm going to move now to an area about 2 ways of knowing. And here's going to be a slide of Jung's great painting of window opening to eternity, which he's putting in visual form this important understanding. So as I've said, the aim of the individuation process is a synthesis of all the partial aspects of our conscious and unconscious, pointing to an unknowable, transcendent center of our personality, which mystical traditions call the soul, Jung called the self, which is always there as a central, archetypal structural element of the psyche. He called it the archetype of the self, had many very, very important writings and paintings about the structure of the self, and particularly in his volume on Aeon, number 9. So what Jung was trying to express is a psychological dimension that far exceeds the limits of our usual conscious self-awareness, identity, sense of self, and experience of everyday reality. So this ontological movement to the unknown within, towards the mystery, towards the divine within, there are many, many ways of articulating this, towards a personal relationship to the Holy Spirit, the numinosum, and the experience of God. So this is where there are many similarities between Jungian psychology and the Christian mystical tradition. So what are they? For both traditions, the immediate experience of the Holy Spirit, the numinous, what we could understand as the presence of God, or the perceiving of an original, hidden, transcendent reality in our soul, plays a pivotal role. However, Jung didn't want to be regarded as a mystic. He wanted to be an empiricist. He thought of himself as a natural scientist, and he confined himself to the investigation of human assertions, psychological assertions about the religious, about God, and grounded his psychology of religion on the interpretation and comparison of these facts. So he tended not to touch the metaphysical God himself. He didn't see himself essentially as a theologian, also, although many other people might see him in that way. Other differences is mystics tend to concentrate on direct encounters with God, like the Spanish mystics and many other, the Flemish mystics or the French mystics or the German. Whereas for Jung, these experiences were subject more to a critical examination. So analytical psychology tends to be more limited to the observation and study of archetypal images and contents. That is, our own human or psychological assertions. For Jung, the inability to know in this regard signified a richness and treasure that he wanted to preserve. And he did acknowledge when he reached the end of what he would have understood as his empirical psychological knowledge and the possible beginning of another deeper wisdom. Other really important similarities, both in Jung's concept of the self. Jung shared the belief that God's presence lies within the center of our soul, expressed from a more psychological perspective rather than a mystical perspective. And my strong belief over a long time is that his writings on the psyche do contain much of the teaching of the Christian spiritual direction and guidance from the past centuries in the idiom of modern depth psychology. Other great similarities, great emphasis on increased consciousness, increased self-knowledge, looking and paying attention to our dreams, to our fantasies and daydreams, and our thoughts and impulses, particularly our unconscious wishes, drives, and impulses, so that we could become aware of ourselves in depth. This is really closely aligned, even from the earliest Christian centuries. The fathers and the teachers always admonished to stay in the cell of self-knowledge, to always direct our surface attention to the hidden motives underlying our conscious behavior, aims, and actions. However, the mystical writers, not just the Christian, but the Jewish and the Sufi traditions, show that there are deeper dimensions of our experience that can be awakened and engaged, leading to another way of knowing. And in Augustine's little paradigm, this is the above us, the third stage, from the journey towards God to the journey in God. It can be understood as a deeper, higher octave within ourselves. So this is a different way of knowing. And Jung wrote about this in the latter part of his writings, particularly in a marvelous text called Introduction to Zen Buddhism. And he says this different way of knowing towards the center of our being is, it's not the erasing of one picture and its substitution by another, which is how the mind works, which is an everyday occurrence, which has none of the attributes of a transforming experience. He says very clearly that aligns with the Christian mystical tradition is that our deeper contemplative experience that transforms can't be explained in this way. He says it's not that something different is seen, but that one sees differently. So we're seeing from a different place within our deeper self. And he says, quite rightly, this new dimension is dependent on the birth of a new center. And he calls that new center the self, which I've been walking around with in this talk. If the transposition, this is from Collected Works 13, if the transposition is successful, and it does away with participation mystique, and the upper stories of our personality can be detached from painful as well from joyful happenings, there can be produced, there's a birth of a deeper personality, which is what some texts call the diamond body, called it the diamond heart or holy fruit. So there's a part of ourselves, a deeper part in our soul that is more aligned to the divine image within us. So here we get to the mystical tradition. The Cloud of Unknowing, the great 14th century English text, calls it the sovereign point of the spirit. The center of our soul, the apex mentis. John of the Cross speaks of the center of the soul. So other writers, if you look at the mystical tradition, they'll describe it in different ways. Certainly in the Orthodox tradition, it's called deification, theosis, deification. A vision of God, birth of the word in the soul, or radical obedience to divine will. So for Teresa of Ávila, it was the spiritual marriage with Christ in the center of the soul. So this ontology, this different way of seeing, is that we're seeing from this place of the center of the soul. We're not seeing anything different, we're seeing from a different place within. So it's not a horizontal change, it's a vertical where our mind is descending into our heart in silence, in deeper being, in stillness. So mystical thought is vertical, going into the descent of the darkness, unknowingness, the mystery of our being, the paradox. And so that's where the Christian mystical writers really come and help us deeply in what God is doing more deeply within our soul. It's the third stage of Augustine's paradigm from the 5th century. So these ways of speaking, in-depth psychology, being viewed vertically, in silence, in rest and timelessness. So I'm going to be going quickly through the symbols of transformation in St Teresa's writings, quite quickly. And here's an icon, quite a famous icon, which I commissioned many years ago, of the interior castle. It has all these symbols in the icon: the castle, the garden, water, fountains, and the butterfly. So this is the major text that I've been called to work on for kind of decades, really. St Teresa wrote it in 1570 in Toledo, Spain, which was the capital of Spain at that time. And she includes many, many really helpful symbols of transformation. And her whole spiritual discourse is centered around the symbols of garden, soul, castle and soul, which she conceived of interior spaces where the soul can enter to find herself and then sees herself in God. And of course, as I said, this builds on Augustine's perspective of deepening interiority in the final third unitive stage. So again, these symbols are designed to help us in this interior retreat, this inwardness and enclosed spaces within. And this deepening interiority of the soul in search of the sense of the supernal light of God, the search for divine love, which can be experienced in the center of our being. So she uses these extraordinary symbols to help the soul, to help the pilgrim enter into the mystery of our being. So you can look at my book, Towards Mystical Union, for much more of an exposition of this. So I'll go through a little bit more quickly. The beauty and dignity of the soul. Basically, Teresa has a great vision towards the end of her life of the interior castle. She says, I thought of the soul as resembling a castle formed of a single diamond or very clear crystal, containing many rooms, just as in heaven there are many mansions. And if we reflect, we see that the soul of the just man is a paradise in which God tells us he takes his delight. How can you imagine? It must be that dwelling in which a king so mighty, so wise and so pure, containing in himself all good, can delight to rest. Nothing can be compared to the great beauty and capabilities of a soul. However keen our intellects may be, they are unable to comprehend them as to comprehend God. For he has told us, he has created us in his own image and likeness. So that's in the first mansion, first page of the interior castle. So again, hopefully this talk might encourage you to look at the text and look at my commentary. So there are 7 dwelling places. Teresa has this vision where the light and glory of God can shine in the center of our soul, in the innermost dwelling place. And so in this text, it's designed in this threefold way, which I explained earlier on, founded on St Augustine's mystical paradigm in the early centuries. So there's a 7-fold division in this threefold way. But what I want to communicate to you is it's a journey of our interiority, centeredness in association with the concept of passage from one interior dimension to another. And even for Teresa, this castle soul is a symbol of a celestial interior building, what we could understand as a microcosm of heaven, at the center of which is a room or place where the king dwells. So she used, like Jung, used the symbol of the diamond center or the diamond heart or the diamond self. And this is a very, like the rose window here. So it's like a mandala that's able to express the many dimensions of the interior life in immeasurable beauty, capacity, and spiritual depth. So I'm leaving it to you to maybe look at the text or reflect on it, but it's holding a paradox, a huge spiritual, psychological paradox, is that this symbol is depicting a mystery, that God is both in us and we are in God or comprehended by God at the same time. It's exactly the same thing. So this symbol of the castle or the diamond or the globe is trying to hold that mystery. In unity, God is penetrating the soul and dwells there, and yet the soul is not fully comprehending God. So from a more mystical perspective, there is a transfusion of our own self by the divine self of God. So just moving to some other symbols. The four waters of prayer. This is incredibly profound. So you've got it in the icon, the four waters of prayer. So what she's describing is the four dimensions of prayer of watering a garden, which is our soul. So she's describing in some depth. She's got it in her autobiography, and I'm going to be doing more writing on this soon. The four methods of irrigation in Teresa's work are similes for the stages of the soul's journey, as a metaphor for distinguishing amongst different stages of prayer. And so the different movement of the waters, which are the waters of the Holy Spirit, as they irrigate our interior castle, and the changes, the discernment, the understanding, is in her text and is one of the great teachings on prayer. Another great symbol in the interior castle is this one of the two fountains. So what she's describing here is in the spiritual journey, when it deepens, there's a movement of the waters of the Holy Spirit. So instead of the teaching and the movement of the waters of the Holy Spirit flowing from outside inside, through friendships, through study, through being part of community, and of course the liturgy and the sacraments, there is a time and a movement, and it's in the way of illumination, the fourth mansion, is that there's a movement of the water from inside out. The fountain starts to flow from our center, like in the oasis in the desert, because it's called the desert tradition. There's a flow of the waters from inside out, trickles from inside out and flows out through our body, mind, spirit, and out to the world. So again, the transformation in the fourth mansion, she starts with this extraordinary paradox and teaching of the two fountains. So when the fountain is flowing more from within, then it means the presence of God is stronger. There can be the sweet perfume of the Holy Spirit. Most souls are called into deepening prayer and silence, a much longer time in stillness and silence, because there's a calling from the flowing waters inside to be in the presence and love of God more clearly, more directly, and in a more transformative way. So the last great symbol is silkworm into a butterfly. So this is a very ancient symbol of transformation. The butterfly is the transformed soul. She has this in the fifth mansion. So there's a transformation of our substance from the place of the worm or the natural state into something very beautiful and transfigured in God. So what I'm trying to communicate is how important and relevant the symbols of transformation are, facilitating growth of our interior imaginal space. And you might have your own symbols of transformation. There are many, many, but these are some of the more famous ones in the Christian tradition. And it's all walking around deeper, more honest self-knowledge in the presence of God, in the contemplation of God. And the last section, I'm just going to mention very briefly, what do some of the great writers speak about in the center of our self? What happens there? The very famous American Trappist monk of the 19th century, Thomas Merton, I hope most of you have heard about him. He's got about 10, 12 books on contemplation and the Christian life. He talks about a concept called the point verge, which is the hiding place of God within us, which is inaccessible to any meddling, and nothing can touch that because it's the divine spark inside of us. And in this quote, so here's a slide of Thomas Merton's really important quote. He says, and this is the Christian tradition, that God's light can shine within us as a blazing light, like this diamond that wakes up. He calls it, which is true, our true self. It's the place where we're not worried. There's no anxiety. It's a place of gratitude, tranquility, peace, graciousness, detachment, and a freedom in love and deep communion with others and the world. This point of poverty and nothingness within us. And here's this wonderful quote here on the slide. At the center of our being is a point of nothingness, which is untouched by sin and illusion, a point of pure truth, a point or spark which belongs entirely to God. This little point of nothingness and absolute poverty is the pure glory of God in us. It's like a pure diamond blazing with the invisible light of heaven. It's in everybody. And if we could see it, we would see these billions of points of light coming together in the face and blaze of a sun that would make all the darkness and cruelty of life vanish completely. I have no program for this seeing. It is only given, but the gate of heaven is everywhere. So this is the possibility and hope for all of us, that we can move and allow that light of heaven or God of the light to shine within us all the time, and just allow that presence to transform our lives, of ourselves, our friends, our family, community, and of course, the world. And as Thomas Merton and all the mystics would say, we are already one, and what we need to do is recover our essential unity.